So what's a beach got to do with video games? Let's find out.
Since Spacies.
G'day invaders, welcome to Since Spacies, and this is a look back at 1980. So in my previous video in this series in 1979, I was talking about how Cronulla was a big important part of my life in gaming at that time because I didn't have a console and the arcades was the only exposure that I had to any sort of video games at that time. So Space Invaders was a huge thing, and that continued on through 1980 for many years to come after that. But we started to see some more games hit the arcade scenes, including one game in particular, PacMan. Now that game was huge, and it was different to anything else that was being released at the time. It was aimed at girls, the girly gamers, the ladies, because it was not focused around destroying things or blowing anything up. It was all focused around surviving in a dark room, eating pills, and trying to hide from ghosts. I think we can all relate to that. So in this video, I'll be talking about all the major developments that happened in 1980, and I'll also be discussing 3 important games in that year to see if we can determine what game of the year for 1980 was. I wonder, I kind of don't know, I'm not sure what game that will be. Let's take a look. In 1980, the makers of Super Smash Bros. HAL Laboratory was to form in this year. They first began by making games for the VIC-20, but soon afterwards they dabbled in Windows and MSX games. But it wouldn't be long before they specialised in Nintendo platforms. And technically they're an independent company, but they share extremely close ties to Nintendo, who have bailed them out financially in the past on numerous occasions. Their biggest accomplishments include Earthbound, the Kirby series, and of course the Smash Bros. Series. Also, Mattel forms Blue Sky Rangers, a team of superstar programmers. Mattel even kept their location a top secret to prevent Atari from poaching them away from them. These guys are probably the first example of a AAA style dev team before that term was even coined. Another landmark release in 1980 was a game called Stratovox, which was the first game to feature voice or speech. Released by Taito and known as Speak and Rescue in Japan, impressively it even spoke Japanese lines in Japan, with the English release being in English as well. Another notable landmark game was a game to be also released by Namco called Rally X, and this game has the honour of being the first game to feature a bonus stage. Also in 1980, Nintendo would go on to release their famous Game & Watch series, and this would be the first time that I personally laid eyes on the Nintendo logo, never hearing of this company before in my life. And the very first game that I got to play with a Nintendo logo on it was in fact Parachute. So for my first Game of the Year contender for 1980, we've got Missile Command. Now this was an arcade release, and it was an Atari release, which was huge at the time. It was a game that uses the trackball, so you had to frantically try and stop the lines coming down and attacking your bases. The bases, or the cities, didn't actually have names on the original one, so it didn't really have a sense of urgency about it. You had to use your imagination a little bit more than maybe in the games that would have followed in years to come. And this came out in an era when the Cold War was still being talked about. It was still very topical. So this game was kind of controversial to some degree. It kind of trivialized the fact that America was actually very realistically under a possible nuclear war threat. So yeah, kind of an odd choice for Atari to release at that moment in time in history. And one thing that made Missile Command very unique was that you had to learn how to make sacrifices. So if you knew a base was about to be blown up but another one was about to be destroyed at the same time, you had to learn, I have to let that base go in order to protect this base. So it's amazing how much you could get out of a simple line, out of a simple game that had just lines rendering going down and attacking bases. You had very limited amount of ammunition to stop the nuclear warheads from attacking your bases. It's hard to explain. When you're playing it, you're actually really keeping your eye and focused on everything going on all at once on the screen. It was actually a very unique game, and it later was ported to the Atari 2600, and that's where I got to spend most of my time with this game. For me, it was an Atari 2600 game more than an arcade experience, and maybe one day I'll get an arcade machine and it will be going here, and I'll be able to rectify that with the trackball experience on Missile Command. So soon after Space Invaders was to hit the arcades in a major craze, another game was to come along, and to some degree it's a lesser known title. A lot of people don't even talk about it, but it was a game that as a kid I really got into this in a big way, and that's called Phoenix. It was the first game to feature an actual boss level, which is kind of crazy when you think about it, but yeah, it had to a game had to begin somewhere with a boss for the first time, and you're looking at it. Actually, you can see the boss there. That's the mothership that was to appear in the third level, and yeah, it made it a bit of a challenge to get to that. So with Space Invaders, you just had endless waves of aliens coming down, and the game didn't really diverse away much from that. Not taking anything away from Space Invaders. I love Space Invaders with all my heart, but the game was very primitive by today's standards, and it was a concept that was quickly adapted on and improved on as the years moved on. So this was a game that actually featured different kind of waves of attacks. You had the birds coming down. If you shot their wings, the wings would fall off, and then if you shot the other wing, then they would die. They would start off as eggs, so you had to try and shoot the eggs before they hatch and turn into full-fledged birds. I know it sounds all weird that you're talking about birds in a spaceship game, but it was a lot of fun to play, and getting to that third boss level was such a big deal when you're a kid. Putting your 20 cents in, or as you Americans would say, putting your quarters in, you wanted to try and make sure that for your money's worth you got up to at least this end boss and beat it, and then it just repeated itself over, and it went into rounds, the first stage, and looped over and over again. The other thing that this game featured, which was a first for me, was a shield button. Now Asteroids also had a shield button, but this one, when you hit the shield button, it made sort of a big deal about the fact that you hit your protection, your shield button, and it made a really cool sound effect. It was something else that you had to think about when playing. Any other game before that, you're just shooting non-stop, but this one you had to think about, oh my god, am I about to be attacked? I better hit that defense button. So it gave you some extra element of gameplay to think about while playing. Again, it sounds all simple by today's standards, but back in, trust me, in 1980, this was big deal. This was such a big game at the time. And for my final Game of the Year contender for 1980, PacMan. Where do I begin with this title? It is such a huge game. And when it was released in the arcades back in the day, it was not initially known to be that it was going to be so successful, but it was a runaway success. But initially, it was a sleeper hit. And when you look back at 1980 and think that was such a iconic title for the time, it's just kind of weird to think that once upon a time people looked at this game and went, I'm not sure if this Pac-Man thing is going to really take off. I mean, you've got this other game over here, Rally X, that looks really cool. No one here watching this video has probably heard of Rally X, I bet. There's only a handful out there of you that are watching this video that remembers or knows of Rally X. So it gives you an idea of how much of a difference there was between the two titles, but everyone was putting their money into Rally X at the time. So the game was developed by a gentleman by the name of Iwatani, or Iwatani-san, and it was started development in 1979, about March, and it was released in 1980, October, I think was the year that it got released. And I'm going to show you a picture of where I got to play it for the very first time. Today it's just a shopping centre, but back then it was kind of like a Walmart or something like that. And that was the first time I laid eyes on PacMan, and I instantly fell in love. The game was just epic to look at, very simple in concept, you had to run around and get all the power pellets and pills and avoid being hit by the ghost. Very simple concept, but back then nothing else had been attempted quite like it, except there was one other game that people do mention that was prior to PacMan that was very, very similar, and that was a game by Sega of all people. It was re-released as PacMan, but I'll put the title up. The name of the game escapes me off memory, but it was very, very much like PacMan but with a car. But PacMan was the first game to give a character, an iconic mascot, if you like, to the game, which then Namco later adopted PacMan as their own mascot. In fact, I'm even wearing PacMan slippers now as I'm speaking, and I've even got a PacMan mug. The game is just so iconic that the PacMan logo could represent video games in general. It's just such a huge title. So the game was initially released to be aimed at the female target audience. It was meant to be not a violent game, so there was no shooting. You were just taking drugs, I think. Is that what you're doing in the game? I don't know. What are the power pellets? It was also the first game to feature a cutscene. Now, the cutscene was very, very basic. PacMan running, getting chased by the ghost, and then he would later get bigger and chase the ghost back. And that's it. Haha, very funny little cutscene. But it was still the very first cutscene in a video game. So kind of weird that we look back on that game and that was its legacy, was to have that as a first. One of the things that really stand out about PacMan as well is that there's no buttons. You just got the controller, the joystick, that is it. So it's quite funny how you can get all this gameplay without any need for a button, and that's ingenious when you look back on it, because every other game back then was using buttons to shoot or buttons to defend or warp. There was all these emphasis or reliance on a button to do something. This game just stripped the buttons totally. You only had buttons for player 1 and 2, and that's it. So yeah, that was something else that was quite unique about the game. And the war exits, that was something that when I was a kid I used to see PacMan run off to the right and reappear on the left. That just spun my mind out when I was a kid, and it's like, oh my god, that is so cool. And he kind of, when he went off to the right and disappeared off screen, he stayed in there for quite an amount of time before he'd reappear. So you kind of, as a kid, you got the thinking, what's he doing when he's off the screen? It's kind of weird. So for my game of the year for 1980, it has to go to PacMan. All the success that game ended up getting was so well deserved. It was such a playable title, and the legacy from that game still lives on to 2018. Everyone looks back at PacMan, and I mean, when I first think of the memories of when I was a kid looking at PacMan, only happy thoughts come to mind. It's just such a good game, and you're just in this little happy special place when you're playing PacMan. You don't get stressed out, and it's so cool to see all these new titles that are being released on Xbox with these Championship Edition versions of PacMan. It is such a cool game to be even playing in 2018. So that's been my look at 1980, and I hope you enjoyed my little look back on the events that took place in that year. These earlier years, the Game of the Year choices are not going to be so difficult to pick, but as this series goes on, I'm going to upset a few of you with the choices that I picked for Game of the Year. There's a couple of years coming up ahead which I'm really nervous about, because I know that I'm not going to have my audience happy with my choices. Yeah, especially you Nintendo lot. There's a couple of games coming up in the years to come that are going to get you guys raging in the comment section. I can just see it. Also, I'd like to do a big special shout out to Benjamin and John Pensini and all my other patrons. You guys help really make this channel come alive, and if you haven't already done so, please have a look down below there at the Patreon link and consider joining up as a patron. It helps keep the lights on in this place, and at the moment I am saving for a webcam so that I can make my podcast look that little bit better than the potato standard camera that it's got at the moment. And also a special warm thank you to DJ Slope for mentioning me in that 10 YouTubers video for under 5,000 subscribers that you should follow. It was such a blast to be included on that prestigious list. I personally have been watching those videos for the last 4 years, I think it's been now, and to be now included in one of his videos as one of the YouTubers that you should follow. That was just such a huge buzz. So if you guys, if you're watching and you've come here from after watching that video, glad to have you on board, and I really do look forward to getting you more content that will go back into the days of when I used to work at Sega, and also when I was working on the Sega hotline, and also when I was writing for video game magazines back in the day. I'm looking forward to doing more content to talk about that time in my life. My name has been Brian, and I've been gaming since Spacies. Thanks, guys.
Since Spacies.